contrary to the popular view, it can be shown and conclusively proved that that has an internal structure of incredible order and beautiful order. It's filled with electromagnetic waves going in bidirections. Pick a frequency, there's a wave going in one direction and a wave in the other direction. The wave that's going backwards is an anti-wave. It's a time-reversed wave. And the vacuum is structured, this potential, a vacuum is just potential is all it is. This potential is filled with a harmonic series of these waves. And so it structures spatially by bidirectional wave sets, and it structures vertically in terms of harmonics. Now, if you then invoke this structure, and you do that with a nonlinear material, and you put in one wave in the nonlinear material, that material will take from the vacuum that excess structure because it turns everything into a potential, and it will put out multiple frequencies and harmonics. That's what nonlinear materials do. Interestingly enough, if you take time-reversed waves and put in those harmonics, when they back up through, they will restore one wave. You can gather the energy and collect it and integrate it together and produce a single thing of much greater energy and lower frequency. And so what you have is the vacuum structures in frequency and spatially, and the connection are waves. And by the way, these waves do not have to move at the speed of light. They can have much greater velocity. Now, the importance of Whittaker's work is that he showed that if you were to take sets of waves that you made on the bench, you made a wave and its anti-wave, and you made the harmonic and its anti-harmonic, you'd have to have at least one interval. In music, we would call that an octave, you know, from C to the next C, for example. If you had at least one octave or one harmonic interval, you would then have a structured vacuum. Now, you can build such sets as these any way you wish to, and each one of those sets is a special form that you can build on the laboratory bench. It also explains the work of Antoine Prioré, who built a machine under the proper scientific auspices and under rigorous testing on lab animals, which cured cancer and leukemia almost 100%. Some eminent French scientists worked with him. It's still in the French medical literature. It was real, it existed. It was squelched. But what I'm saying is, if you use the Whittaker approach, you can now, for the first time, understand how Priore's device worked, because that's what it did. And he used a rotating plasma to make his phase conjugates. We didn't even know about the phase conjugate in those days. Today, we know that one of the things plasmas do under the right circumstances is phase conjugate, or time reverse. And he showed that you can cure cancer, leukemia. You could just as easily set a pattern that would cure AIDS. He showed you could clean out clogged arteries. You could change the immune system, increase the immune system, bring it back up, which would be very valuable to AIDS patients, for example. For every disease, there is a pattern which causes the disease in this structure. For the cure to every disease, you simply take its pattern and time reverse it, and you get the precise electromagnetic antidotes. You then put that inside a potential, as Whittaker showed how to do, and you treat the body with that, which is like like normal electromagnetic radiation. It's not ionizing radiation. It's not nuclear radiation. Expose them to a rippling magnetic field, for example, with these embedded in the field, and you cure the disease.
Now let's lay one issue to rest. The average physicist who knows about this, in the face of 1,000 papers already in the literature proving this, experimentally and everything else, theoretically, does not believe it's a time-reversed wave, even though we've described the characteristics. Oh, well, it's a wave front reversal. We prefer to say you can't go backwards in time, you can't go into the past. Immediately he reveals his ignorance. Let's reason together. I said this wave was time-reversed. Did I say that every single particle of mass in the whole cotton-picking universe was time-reversed and backed up to a previous state of the universe, which is what the past would be? Nobody said any such thing. The theory doesn't predict any such thing. And if he thinks that's what I'm saying, he doesn't understand time reversal, and he doesn't understand quantum mechanics, and he doesn't understand physics, and he's put a label around his own neck and on his own forehead. Not me, he has done it. I want to give you a way to visualize a time-reversed wave and settle this issue of going back to the past. I want you to imagine a movie of scenes going on here. And in this scene, somewhere amongst all the surroundings and all, and buildings and all this, there is a wave generated. Okay? And you're watching this wave go. You're magic, so you can watch it real slow, and you're watching it go. And suddenly we say, now that wave and that wave only is reversed in time. We can't see time. Quantum mechanics tells us it's not an observable. You can't detect it even in principle. What we will see is the spatial aspect. We will see it crawfish backwards, spatially. We'll see everything else continue. So what would I physically see and observe? I'd see the whole rest of the world going along in positive time. I would see this crazy wave suddenly stop where it's time reversed and start to crawfish backwards and crawl back right along its path. Meanwhile, everything else is going on just like it was. That's all time reversal is. Think of it as space reversal. But it carries negative energy. And that's magic, as we found out, because you can get inertia and gravity from that. If you get down at the right frequency. Optically, you'll never get it. Radar, you'll never get it. Okay, let's continue. To show you how strange a breed of cat this time-reversed wave is, I want to compare a normal mirror to a time-reversed mirror, a phase conjugate mirror, they call it. In the top one, I show you a standard mirror over on the right, on a point source. The light from it scatters across the surface of the mirror and has the standard diverging pattern reflection. As I show that, that's optical geometry. Everybody knows that. Normal reflection. So if you're doing that, light scattering from the toe of your shoe across the mirror, there's one point where you get the right angle, comes to your eye, so you can see your toe, you can see your knee, you can see your clothes and everything, and you stand there and look in the mirror, and you're quite happy with that. Let's look at a phase conjugate mirror. The light from the source, which may be the toe of your shoe, scatters across the surface of the mirror. From every point on the surface of the mirror, it reflects right back to the original point. Boogity boogity, it crawfishes backwards. Boogity boogity boogity, right back to the point. What could you see if you looked in such a mirror? Could you see your toe? All that light goes back to your toe. Could you see your knee? The only thing you could see would be the two black retinas of your eyes, nothing else. It's a quite different breed of cat. This is out of the standard literature by Pepper. That's not Tom Bearden. It's a quite different breed of cat from an ordinary EM wave, and you must understand that. It does not behave the same. And I want to quote Pepper on something else, because I want to point out to you there's a whole new physics here, there's a whole new world. Pepper said, the real and the major discoveries in phase conjugation and time-reverse waves are yet to be made, so have at it, young fellow. There's 100 Nobel Prizes waiting on you. What it is, it's a time-reverse wave. It carries negative time. It carries negative energy. They say it has a healing property. It restores the order that where distortion crept in. And in Scientific American, Pepper publishes a beautiful picture, absolute marvelous work, showing phase conjugation of the distorted image of a cat, and the thing backs up into a nice, beautiful picture of the cat again. No problem. It does distortion correction. It moves from disorder back to order. It has negative entropy. So much for the hopelessness of the second law of thermo. They always assume positive time. Here's a critter moves in negative time. It's time reversed. And it takes care of the hopelessness of the second law and recreates hope for everybody. Now, why the hell do you age? You age because most of the stuff going on is positive energy waves. You got all those electron shells around your atoms. If you could capture the delta in the spectrographic pattern, there are spectrographic ways, spectroscopic ways of doing this very detailed wavefront analysis, usually by digital synthesis, not Fourier synthesis. Do it in impulse waves. And use one more law. Here's one from Bearden. It ain't in your textbook. Please remember this, because The previous speaker had an example of it looking at you. If you take randomness, like the virtual flux of vacuum, and you impose upon that the structured potential, the artificial potential, the scalar EM wave, very technically it produces what today we call chaos, technically. I'm not using chaos in the general sense, I'm using chaos in the technical sense. But that's a science today. But it blows ordinary science. And the chaos patterns that she showed, using 1,000th or 1/10,000th second, and then adding them, what you were doing is getting back at the digital synthesis of what's really there in the signal. Your body's been using that. Living Systems has all the time. That's the way to go. She's right exactly on the track. That's exactly the way to go. Anyway, you age because of your electron shells in your atoms. But if you map the delta between the aging cells and the younger cells, and if you time reverse that delta, and if you radiate the body with that time reverse delta, you will have a signal which will move the body gradually from age back to youth. I'll say that again in case that went by you. You capture the aging pattern, that's like the Kosnashiev work. You time reverse that pattern, you have the rejuvenation pattern. And if you bathe the body and continually charge it up with that pattern, it will gradually spread out through Dr. Pop's communication system, and he discovered in the body. The virtual state is scalar, and you will rejuvenate the body. If you capture the delta in a diseased cancer cell, simply subtract the scalar pattern of the normal cell from the disease pattern and you'll have the delta. Then if you time reverse the delta, you will now have the specific healing pattern for that specific illness in that specific body. It was done, it's been proven. It was called the Priore machine in France. Mid-60s to mid-70s. Okay, Priore lab, I want to tell you about healing cancer. What Priore did, this is his little setup he healed all the rats and the lab animals with. Up above this big coil here, there is a rotating plasma fed by 17 frequencies up in the gigahertz band. Rotating plasmas are one thing that do phase conjugation. We know today. They didn't know it in the West in 1965. And so he has a rippling magnetic field, strong magnetic field, which by magnetic resonance will get him into the nucleus of all the atoms, by nuclear magnetic resonance. Why the nucleus? Because he's got to get down where the negative energy stuff and the negative time stuff is and the electrogravity is. That's where the control system of the immune system and the living systems are. Living systems have had to use negentropy to keep producing the same kind of species pattern. Otherwise, the law of entropy would eat them alive after about 3 generations. You couldn't transmit the pattern anymore. There wouldn't even be species. You have to use negative entropy, and that's why living systems use negative energy, negative time, and scalar waves. He produces then a phase conjugate pattern. He's learned what the right mixture is to give him the anti-pattern for that cancer. It comes right back down through, gets down into the bone cells, everything else, bathes every cell in a little animal, and reverses to cancer. If you de-differentiate, a cancer cell turns back to a normal cell. Now, Robert Becker should have the Nobel Prize for proving how little weak picoamperes of current heal bone. It takes the red blood cell, shucks off the hemoglobin, the thing regrows the genetic nucleus with all the genetics, turns into that kind of cell. That's called de-differentiation, going back to a more primitive cell. That ain't what's needed, so it then crawls around and turns into the kind of cell that makes cartilage. That ain't what's needed, so then it crawls around and changes into the kind of cell that makes bone and heals these horrible bone fractures. And he proved that in vitro with frogs after he'd healed bone, terrible bone fractures. Should have a Nobel Prize. Nobody had the foggiest notion it was the red blood cells responding to picoamperes of current. Tiny currents, so small you can't hardly measure them. Can you not do picoamperes with this thing in the body? Of course you can. Can you not drive cells through that whole structure? Of course you can. You can do electromagnetic healing of any kind of cellular disease known to man. You don't have to understand the cause. You just got to capture the delta and time reverse it and do that to the body and you'll cure it.
Yes, and this is just reinforcing, and this was Paul's inspiration to use this as our logo, and this is Paul's drawing on the logo here, that the opposing plasma tubes are precisely phase conjugate. And that's the point we wanted to make here, is that, you see, when you look at Priore's frequencies, and most of you have noticed this before, but the day that Paul and I decided to build Theraphi was the day I discovered right here. These are the frequencies, the actual frequencies Priore so famously used with the Priore device to heal thousands of cancers. He used the frequencies 3, 10, 32, and 80. Those are the frequencies. Presumably, he got them in part from the trial and error of Rife and Lakhovsky and Tesla. And then later, I looked at my equation. I said, oh, look at that, 2.78, 11, 30.88, and 80.85. These are the frequencies that almost precisely fit my equation for this phase conjugate negentropic collapse. So once I saw that in Priore, we knew, when I discussed this with Paul, the physics of the pure principle behind Priore. Remember, Priore spent millions of dollars building very expensive devices. Of course, electronics were much more costly in those days, but never was able to teach the pure principle. What is negentropy? So, of course, since he couldn't describe the physics of why it works, that means you can never agree on how to optimize the process. And that's why the Priore device ultimately could not be replicated. So once we understood the physics behind that, that's what enabled us to build the Theraphi. And note, with the Theraphi, then we take that whole cascade up to the megahertz range, and the high frequency end is precisely phase locked to exactly that cascade. But the high frequency components of Theraphi, of course, are the intellectual property, some of the intellectual property here, and how we can see that tuning. Just gonna mute one other microphone here so we get that background noise. Okay. So, and then this is a little discussion about Priore and Bearden and those frequencies, and all of that material on Priore and Bearden, as you well know, is at theraphi.net/static, including dozens and dozens of the Priore papers we have thanks to Tom Bearden, who certainly is a pioneer in this area. And by the way, that brings up the question of, Bearden is one of the people that can help us make the connection to between what used to be called scalar and torsional waves to what I believe now in current physics and technical scientific literature needs to be called longitudinal EMF, because the term scalar in physics and conventional engineering means something entirely different. It simply means a scalar vector. So when you use the term scalar in a technical conversation, you mislead people. Whereas if you say longitudinal EMF, they have a precise idea what you mean. And most electromagnetic devices do not produce longitudinal EMF unless they're phase conjugators. And this is just a slide. Most of you have seen this. This is old news, showing that Lakhovsky, who obviously impressed Priore with some of his information, was explicitly using golden mean ratio in the capacitance of his device, but obviously not broad spectral and not optical and no plasma. But the thing was that the Lakhovsky people in France now, many of whom professionals using Lakhovsky device who have now tested the Priore, all say the same thing, that the Priore device feels like the Lakhovsky device, but much more powerful and much, much faster, which is exactly consistent with our hypothesis here, which is that simply by making it more broad spectral phase accurate in opposing pairs using the plasma, we make something which is far more potent and far faster, as indeed. So the theory fits the practice here. And this is just showing some of the early equations here, where the low frequencies predicted by pure phase conjugation on the top, which are those numbers in blue 2.78, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8, those fall right out of the equation. And then if you compare those with those in green at the bottom, those are the Schumann Earth frequency harmonics. And so we hypothesize strongly that the negentropy of Gaia to self-organize could be improved by simply tuning those already close Schumann harmonics to a more precise cascade. And by the way, that exact frequency series is precisely the definition of the alpha, beta, theta brainwaves of human bliss. So that's phase conjugate negentropy examples. And many people have commented on how useful this parallel is. So we just mentioned again that so many people have studied the physics of the Homa, which is Agnihotra. We visited a farm famously in Poland there. It was beautiful, thanks to our Polish sponsors there, Barbara and friends. And the whole farm was dedicated to practicing Agnihotra, the home. And the fertility, it was like a Garden of Eden in a wasteland. The fertility effect on the environment was amazing. And when they lit that Agnihotra ignited organic plasma butter at precisely sunrise, sunset, so the phase angle was 90 degrees and 9180, literally four-wave mixing. And by the way, there's an inverted pyramid underground, and the pyramid they lighted in, which is copper or gold, is capacitively conjugate. So you have a narrow spectral conjugation, the capacitance of that pyramid. You have atomic conjugation, which is the plasma of the lit butter itself. And then you have long wave phase conjugation embedded precisely with the right angle to the sun at precisely sunrise, sunset. And my hair stood up dramatically, and there was a radiance of immense healing. I mean, fertility would spread and harmony in the land. And all. In fact, it said that the survivors of the nuclear holocaust of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the ones who practiced Agnihotra, were able to heal themselves. This is a legend in Japan, but now we know why, because phase conjugation is the opposite of radioactivity. So the phase conjugate physics of Agnihotra is an instruction to the plasma physics behind Theraphi. Truly, it's a beautiful concept to be understood in science. And this is just the equation, my equation, which Mark helped me implement now in Google Docs using Google equations, but my original equation proving that the radii of hydrogen are phase conjugate, and this is old, most people have seen this, and this is where we proved that the equation for phase conjugation predicted the 1.9 angstrom wavelength exactly of the adenosine diphosphate ADP ATP, which is the universal currency microwave length of all cellular metabolism, phase conjugate implosion, and how I saw Kundalini measured in the microwave with Bob Gratch based on this ATP. So the body is radiating very specific frequencies of microwave based on adenosine diphosphate ADP ATP, the universal dollar bill of cellular metabolism's energy wavelengths, and that is a phase conjugate implosive wavelength, meaning literally negentropy in the cell. And here, this is just showing how we then applied that same equation to the two frequencies of heart rate variability, phase conjugate collapse, and how they then entrain. So the two frequencies of HRV, LF, and VLF, LF and HF fit the equation for phase conjugation, but more even profoundly, that my equation comes to the number 0.0959 hertz, where 0.1 hertz is the very famous LF frequency of the Mayer wave, the fundamental resonance frequency of the music of the body's blood pressure. It's the musical signature of the body. So a lot of the stuff that Patrick is programming in our new biofeedback is based on that 0.1 hertz breathing technique. And you can read about that at craniosacral-app.com, which is another website supporting the iThrive.com biofeedback project. So when you see your Mayer wave, your resonance going to zero, which Patrick and other sacrocranial specialists have confirmed, responding to Theraphi, the spine liquid pump goes to a still point frequently, which is well known as the healing crisis or healing turning point, because when the compressions are perfectly convergent, the production of a still point means that emerging from the still point, all waves are sorted. That's what phase conjugate negentropy means, which means that the spine liquid pump will then restart in greater phase coherence, which is a prime example of how you produce healing and rejuvenation, because literally produce increased net order. So this ability to measure the spine liquid pump component, the Mayer wave, is inherent to the phase conjugate frequency recipe, which that's about. This is just showing some of the Priore documentation we have at theraphi.net static. These are extensive, long documents in PDF showing the details of the thousands of cases of cancer and other diseases that were healed by the Priore device, which we now believe that our device has the potential to go even farther. But we're conservatively waiting until we have the clinical documentation, taking it one step at a time. But for example, just why the Theraphi would increase blood circulation and therefore feeling, for example, a limb or extremity that had lost feeling or circulation. The reason is simple, that blood is designed to be a charged circulation device, and charged circulation is optimized precisely by what is a fractal or conjugate field. So making the perfect electric field defined as sacred space, charged circulation optimized, the very definition of sacred space, is exactly what Theraphi does, and so it's very simple, solid physics that teaches why that conjugate field increases circulation. That's fundamental. Paul, sorry you're having trouble with the internet there. You know, we had a little burp here too. The internet is one of those fickle things. I hope that maybe you can turn your camera on again later or anytime you want, Paul, there. This is just a zoom in on the slide for the actual calculations now. In red are the actual frequencies predicted by my equation, including the Meyer wave 0.1 hertz here. In green are the tidal low frequencies of the spine liquid pump, which Patrick, our programmer for iThrive.com, has dedicated his life to. So now you can see why the spine liquid pump is so responsive to the Theraphi, because the Theraphi is making exactly the frequencies that the spine liquid and the brain waves make when they achieve peak perception and bliss and peak experience. And the brainwave entrainment and spine liquid entrainment of the Theraphi is no accident. It's by intention. This is all part of my new book at fractalfield.com. Joseph is saying, if we're waiting for Paul, I would like to ask Dan if plasma can affect the pH of growing environments and if this contributes to the peak growing environment. Well, I could say that phase conjugate piezoelectricity, the nozzle in the flow form of the imploder.com. We have extensive evidence there at the super imploder research site, which I'll put the link in here, is fractalfield.com/imploder magnetic research. So we have multiple laboratories there reporting that when you take, remember, the nozzle geometry, the vortex in the super imploder, is the same equation we applied to Theraphi. It's literally hydrogen radii. That's why we call that vortex 5 spirals on the perfect 60-degree cone. We call it Schauberger's dream. So if you take the water going down that implosive cone, that's precisely the way water wants to do charge collapse to achieve bliss, charge communion. Now, if the water entering that vortex is piezo, which is, say, conductive hard or mineral, like biodynamic preparations with the quartz or calcite powders that are piezo, then the capacitance of that cone is itself so bioactive that seeds growing nearby increase in growth, just like Claire is now helping us to demonstrate and prove that seeds growing treated with Theraphi grow faster, just like is well documented for seeds that have been exposed to Stonehenge. So the reason that, this is the core physics of bioactivefield.com. Bioactivefield.com. Now, I have strayed from your question. To answer your question, several of the laboratories there at Imploder Magnetic Research have shown that we are able to alkalinize pH and to beneficially affect redox with that piezo vortex cone of the imploder. And it makes logical sense, because obviously if the waters become more centripetal, that is the opposite of acidity, and also it moves the redox in a useful dimension. And thank you, Claire. Look at Claire is really helped. Thank you, Claire, for all your help here. Claire is helping us also do the seed research and has published some beautiful pictures of that. And I actually have those pictures here in this show. And Claire is commenting here that the water treated with Theraphi is definitely more alkaline. Thank you. Beautiful. And also Peter in Belgium confirmed that the Bovis measurements made of water treated with Theraphi was literally off the charts, as measured by a professional there in Belgium. Roger Green is saying, ability to time reverse biological degeneration. Perhaps a definition of time reversal would be good. Well, thank you, Roger. I have long contended from the perspective of my book, Origin of Negentropy, that you can time reverse rusted steel back to unrusted, but you cannot do the reverse. All on the mirrors. No, what it means is you can return to order, but you can never time reverse to disorder, which is fundamental. So actually in physics, it's my view that time reversal is a very limited idea. You cannot, when physics says that the time reversal that happened in phase conjugate optics has taken something back to the past, what they actually mean is they mean that it has taken it back to a state of order at its root condition, literally the definition of what it is to de-differentiate a stem cell, which is why we are convinced we will be able to affect stem cell de-differentiation, which is to say the very word stem means root of the fractal. So time reversal in this sense, in my view, doesn't mean, even in phase conjugate optics where physicists use the term time reversal, it doesn't mean, oh, well, I've gone back to the 16th century. No, it doesn't exactly mean that. If you actually study what physicists have measured, they have measured that they can take something back to a state of increased order similar to what it has been in the past, which is why that is a beautiful description of what we want Theraphi to be doing to living cells, which is to say to go back to a condition of increased order. So if the body had more order in the past, our belief is, in theory, we can help it move back to that state of increased order. So literally and specifically what we mean by time reversal here is rejuvenation. We do not mean going back to the past. We mean going back to a state of increased order like it was in the past. Exactly. Yes, thank you. Negentropic, in other words. Yes, yes. So that's, I mean, that's my 2 cents worth here. And there are other physicists who are highly opinionated about this, and I would respect their opinions as well. But that's my opinion from my having studied, what they mean by time reversal in phase conjugate optics. So my view of the negentropy that we can create, and the reason, let me explain also, if I can, the reason why I believe we can create increased order, and why we could then take a stem cell back to its stem root of fractality, how the stem cell got its name. Obviously, the growth of biology is an unpacking of a field effect from a fractal root. Fractality defines biology because it defines the negentropy that biology makes. It's literally like an unpacking rose. So when you want to take a cell back to a state where it's unpacking closer to its root of fractality, there's an electric field path to there that's related to perfect compression, which then defines perfected decompression. And we now know that perfect compression is precisely what a fractal field is, hence phase conjugate. So visualize that. Can we visualize that together? Well, here's my visualization for you. So everybody knows that when we're talking about phase conjugation, we mean 2 pine cones that learn to kiss noses. Vortex, and everybody agrees, and it's a useful metaphor. But where the 2 pine cones kiss noses is actually the spiral down the cone, taking the transverse to the longitudinal compressional, precisely converging and meeting, precisely tuned to the Planck sphere. And, Mark and I and Nassim all agree on this shtick about the Planck sphere being the musical key signature of the universe. So when the inertia, the compressional wave, converges symmetrically, and it must be symmetrically around the Planck sphere, the same way you do an O'Fana-Minokian ritual, the same way you phase conjugate lasers. So the pine cones kiss precisely at the Planck sphere. Now, you got these pressure waves converging around the Planck sphere. First, like a cube, as in full wave mixing, phase conjugate optics, 4 lasers, 2 lasers in, 4 out. But if now that compression going towards center of the Planck sphere is nutated, and that's what the phase conjugate barium sodium titanate does in the phase conjugate mirror. This relates to the coating on the bottom of Nostradamus' cup. And this relates to the high dielectric content of the John Dee showstone. It's what scrying is. It's why scintillation is what John Dee studied to conjure, because perfect reflection, literally the perfect twinkle, is how you call the ancestors. Why is it that you can conjure, which is to conjugate, with the perfect twinkle, what the John Dee called scintillation, the study of the angles of reflection to conjure, to conjugate? It's because the perfect twinkle is simply the perfect convergent point for the flux paths to cause that compressional wave to enter symmetrically at the perfect tuning of the Planck sphere, obviously. And then that means you've got perfect resonant compression, literally a perfect rose-shaped bell, perfect nested dodeca inside the Planck sphere, which has perfect longitudinal radio connection. So the whole galaxy, everywhere there's DNA. So what can emerge from that compression are only waves that are locked into phase with that array, which literally means fit that musical key signature. And so if the only wave that then bounce back out of the phase conjugate mirror at the complement set of the supplement angle have been time reversed, what they mean is they have been returned to order. What they mean is everything was sorted. So the sorting mechanism exists inside the black hole at the center of that compression point, which is this Planck sphere. And why it's sorted is because only waves which can agree can bounce back out. And that agreement is golden ratio phase conjugation to Planck. So that's how increased order occurs inside the perfect black hole, which is the Planck sphere, phase conjugated by golden ratio to Planck. That's the basis of my whole theory. So the waves are forced to agree by the perfect focus. That's the idea. And we never knew before what the perfect focus was until we learned phase conjugation, golden ratio to Planck. So that's my description, if you will, of the physics of why we increase order, because perfect agreement exists in that center where all waves agree. And that's spiritual, metaphoric, but it's also pure, solid physics. And you can take that to your meditations as well as your physics teacher. Okay, and here this slide is called the Shen stone, which is the Hyward firestone, which is what we mean by a stone that can phase conjugate dielectrically, which was called the altar in the church, or access to a black hole, or the Shen schematic. You guys all know that conversation. We've been there before. And this was my little descriptive model of why you can address things like cancer with a phase conjugate cascade, like Priore did. Because cell metabolism is a sequence of steps. And visualize it oversimplistically, but usefully, incoming proteins as food are relatively long wavelengths. And metabolism is the process of taking the long waves, incoming protein, incoming food, etc., and massaging the envelope down a caduceus cascade to shorter and shorter wavelengths, which means increased order, increased information density. So you have food, proteins coming in, then you have a DNA precursors, and ultimately you have the genetic material itself. And every biophysicist will agree that the motor of cell metabolism is high quality ultraviolet light, literally shortwave, blue fire, sex juice, whatever you want to call it. Now, when that ultraviolet coherence field builds up at the center of the cell has to do something with it. This is the physics of the sexual relations for cells. So if the ultraviolet blue fire sex juice of the cell builds up at the center, one of two things has to happen. The ultraviolet creative juice, the best stuff, the blue fire of the cell, either is fed in to replicate the DNA, and there's a blue fire aura, literally a flash, accompanying mitosis and meiosis. So there's an ultraviolet flash, literally. Or that ultraviolet coherence can radiate outward and pass through the membranes through the process of touch permissive behavior, which is the physics of how cells do stuff collectively. So effectively, cancer occurs when the path for the ultraviolet coherence can't bounce out back through the cell membrane because the cell membrane got too hard and too spherical, and spherical cells define cancer. And failure to inhibit replication due to touch is the definition of cancer. So what it is that the ability to propagate that coherent ultraviolet through the cell membrane into creative collective activity instead of being focused back inward into premature replication. Exactly like, younger teenage girls, if you teach them dance and music and poetry and, all this creative stuff, then they don't have babies too early. But if they don't have anything to do with their creative juices, then obviously they're going to have premature babies. They're going to teenage pregnancies, etc. So creative juice for cells is exactly like creative juices for teenage kids. And the reason that a phase conjugate cascade provides a way out for that UV is because the phase conjugate cascade allows the built-up ultraviolet creative juice to again achieve charge distribution. So charge distribution efficiency, which is the definition of a phase conjugate field in fractality, is also the electrical definition of the opposite of cancer. Failure to distribute charge is the name of cancer. The reason that when cells failure to distribute charge via touch is why contact inhibition did not inhibit replication. Failure to touch, literally because the touch doesn't distribute the high quality coherent light. So when you find a way to distribute the high quality coherent light to achieve charge distribution efficiency for around those cells, that is the opposite of cancer electrically. So describing cancer in electrical terms, charge distribution efficiency is by definition the solution of cancer. Now, I say that that complements perfectly Albert Szent-György's famous book, Electronic Biology and Cancer. I believe he won it, and it was a Nobel Prize related for that. Now, what he meant was that you had something called a triplet state electron. The triplet state electron was simply an electron that could be well distributed, just like Jesus and his cousins were well distributed in the wagon train. So extended family required to raise a child. A village is required to raise a child. For electrons are just like that. If they can be well distributed, the triplet state electron, a well distributed electron is touch permissive and by definition the opposite of cancer. And that's Albert Szent-György's whole thesis about the triplet state electron in electronic biology and cancer. So you see how that fits perfectly this model of why increasing a phase conjugate charge distribution efficiency, fractal field, creates the electric field, which is inherently the opposite of cancer. Now, obviously, if there's a well-developed cancer, it's going to take some time for this field to build. And I would even comment here. Remember, we're being very conservative here. We're not making any claims, as Paul just mentioned, but we can report that many of our Theraphi users have reported cancer solutions. And I would even mention a couple of them, and we're going to make these reports far more clinical and disciplined. But in Calgary there, when Bill D it helped someone who was dying of lung cancer, and they did find that they got the solution, but they used Theraphi in synergy with a highly alkalinizing diet, actually. And you see how the two fit together beautifully. Now, in the US and elsewhere, where they had that lady that had that huge tumor in her female organs, and they were able to help her with Theraphi. But there also they used Theraphi in conjunction with a strong cannabis hemp oil that had been treated with Theraphi. And the ability of Theraphi to potentize oils is immense and beautiful and powerful and needs to be explored. But they're very convinced that potentizing things like hemp oils with Theraphi exponentially increases their power. So they again use the hemp oil in synergy with the Theraphi and had great results with a life-threatening cancer. And there's similar stories now in, of course, Belgium and in Norway, where they're using superimploder, which is basically highly alkalizing and also nanobubble hydrogen. So they're using imploded water, superimploder, in a spa environment with the Theraphi. And again, that synergy together seems to be very effective, and that process is working well as we evolve suggested protocols to use the Theraphi. Gary Clark says, I wonder what would happen if someone with a finger cut off spent extended time in Theraphi. Well, I can tell you that the medical doctor who walked into the Theraphi demo there in Perpignan had just seriously cut his finger in the door. It was bleeding, it was hurting. And it got cold quicker, the blood stopped, the bleeding stopped within minutes, it got cold, and the pain was gone within minutes. But I would say that, you know, if a doctor were trying to reattach a finger, the charge distribution efficiency that Theraphi helps with, I think, could be very useful at a certain phase. And Jill says, saying plasma can be actually used to gasify hemp so that the oils separate. Interesting, interesting. And Banked is contributing here. Thank you, Banked. Banked has been pioneering that movement to combine the superimploder, the imploder.com, with the Theraphi. And thank you for your comment. So he says, our superimploder is just smashing good here at Rosita up in northern Norway. So actually, Banked is a specialist in the Norwegian tradition of using a certain fish rat oil. That then the oil is so healing, just very parallel to the hemp oil, and zapping the Theraphi with zapping the living oil, in this case a healing oil from the fish that's famous for healing, to energize that oil. Basically, oil is a media for the charge distribution efficiency. So potentizing the oil, which is, there's lots of ways to do it, but the Theraphi is probably, we believe, one of the most powerful ways to potentize healing oils. Great. Yes, and so Banked is very appropriate. Banked from Norway, who has also led other Theraphi installations there. Thank you very much, Banked, is listing his website there, rositarealfoods.com, for that very famous and traditional healing fish oil, which now can be potentized with Theraphi there from Bank's group in Norway. And Bank has training for that, and Bank has inspired Joseph Cirillo, who is with us, and Trivia in Norway. And so thank you for being with us and for pioneering that work. So we're expecting more soon detailed reports as we get these Theraphi set up there in Norway of the effect of potentizing healing oils using the Theraphi. Thank you very much. And Bengt has been kind enough to put a link there. And Joseph, who works with Bengt, Joseph is New Jersey, Eastern US there, fish liver oil. Thank you very much. Yes, yes, all great. So this was just a picture of the Theraphi system. You've all seen this. And Paul has made many improvements here in the tube design, etc. And part of it, remember the Theraphi manual and the Theraphi protocol, those links are on the website and available to you. This is a picture of an early setup of the Theraphi system. Now the tubes will look even more elegant, but gives you an idea. And remember that the distance from the bifiller Tesla coil in the big box emits a low frequency electromagnetic, which is part of the healing process. But it is notable that, so it's very useful that the person being healed be reasonably not too distant from the bifiller Tesla with a huge low frequency magnetic component coming from this box. But it's also true that the main amplifier here needs to be a relatively fixed distance. So these two wires, or now it's one wire, that connects the amp box to the main Tesla coil need to be relatively extended, because the amplifier here cannot be too close to this Tesla coil box, because the magnetic field density, which is very powerful, very healing, will actually distort the transistor amplifier mechanism. So the spacing of these components is relatively critical. And Paul was just speaking too that these high voltage wires here that goes up to the tubes should probably touch only glass because of corona discharge. And also this box here needs to be located clearly on an insulator. For example, if it's a concrete floor with metal rebars, which is really not so good, then that box should be on a thick insulator, because even corona discharge from that box, because any kind of corona discharge will weaken the field, obviously not good. So, you know, insulation here does matter. And these are some pictures. You've always all seen these pictures. This is the Theraphi show. Notice that for the kind of bliss experience, the head to foot, relaxed head to foot, very lovely environment. We have many people have the euphoria experiences. Very useful for that, which is also very therapeutic. But if you have something like this person here who had a serious metal plate in their foot, and we were able to help them, they were able to walk and lose pain here, you really focus in the field. So the tubes are precisely designed so you can space them according to the need. And here this person was having lots of pain and difficulty walking with their knees, and you're able to help circulation, and as Dr. Gerald showed, decrease inflammation. Here this person had, this is in Belgium now, he had a lost feeling in his hand, really lost feeling, and we were able to help him quite substantially. That's one of the things we can do pretty regularly, pretty dependably, we believe, from the anecdotal reports, is that localized pain and localized loss of feeling, local loss of circulation, we can often help in just 1 or 2 sessions. Now, long-term or chronic pain, we can often, but not always help, but in many cases that will take, you know, say 3 to 8 sessions, 1 or 2 sessions a day, 3 to 6 minutes each, that kind of thing. But we have been able to help quite a few people with long-term pain as well. So there's a question here from Hugh. Would it help to potentize flax seed oil with Theraphi? It is highly likely, and we're just, you know, trying to really publish data on this, but it's highly likely that, you know, nutritional oils zapped with Theraphi will be potentized. It would make total sense, and we encourage those research to be done. And you would just sit it in the field for something on the order of 4 to 8 minutes, something like that. Relatively focused in the field, and you can do that once or twice, and that should dramatically affect that healing oil. It doesn't take too long, actually. And the question here was given: can we do distance healing with Theraphi on people with pacemakers, metal in the body? Several people have begun doing work with distance healing. We know, for example, that people who actually see and hear the Theraphi in operation in virtual video over internet, even over Skype in group work, that you can see and hear and feel this at a distance. And we have multiple people say that after lots of Theraphi sessions, for example, Mike Harris said, that he can feel pretty much a Theraphi turned on elsewhere on the planet just because he's so in tune with it. So it's definitely something you can feel at a distance. And we understand very much why, because that's the nature of longitudinal interferometry. So we believe that there are ways you can do remote healing absolutely with Theraphi. And you know, the difference between ceremonial magic and physics becomes a narrow border, but now we understand a lot more about the physics of ceremonial magic actually, and so we understand how remote healing works, and there are certain conditions which enable it, including having the person on the receiving end in something that approximates highly charged or sacred space or aligned ley lines, etc. So they're more receptive to the longitudinal interferometry, which is the physics of remote healing, cozy rev, etc., etc. Quantum entanglement, exactly, John. Thank you. John Hargrave from Australia with us there. Thank you for joining us, John. How wonderful. Yes, yes. And whether you can then help people remotely at a distance, very good point. That if somebody has a pacemaker, we think that we recommend not allowing anyone with electronics inside their body, like pacemakers, because of the danger of high voltage disrupting. So really, we emphatically recommend and warn not to have people with pacemakers, etc., use Theraphi until we have a lot more information. Although we understand Dr. Gerald is doing some experiments in those regards, but we recommend only medical people do that kind of work. But people have a little bit of metal in their body. We're finding more and more that we can help them, that metal presumably not being part of electronics. And you want to be careful for heating, etc. But the point that was well made there, that if somebody did have say a pacemaker or something, doing some kind of remote healing with the Theraphi, with that kind of person, is probably less risky and a useful experiment. Again, try it gently, but it's something you could try. Yes, absolutely. Bengt is saying we had a person online in Skype and Theraphi for more than 10 hours after a session in Australia. We are in northern Norway, and he said it worked well. Yes, so we're getting more, thank you, Bengt, we're having more and more reports of ability to do remote healing kinds of things with Theraphi. And since we understand more and more the physics of how that works, which is these longitudinal waves crossing at a distance, we can even tell people how to make that work better, you know, if the person is at a ley line cross, for example. I would just give you a simple example of that. When Cozy Rev was about to set up a Cozy Rev mirror to accomplish remote telepathy and all the things that Korotkov documented, the first thing they did, they would actually measure the local Earth magnetic line in nanoteslas for flux density. And if there was not a magnetic line cross of Earth, they would not set up a Cozy Rev mirror. Cozy Rev mirror is basically a giant metal cylinder, which is microwave tuned, obviously, and I believe now we know how to do that, microwave tuning to ATP, ADP. And that's the physics of telepathy. Longitudinal to microwave, the bodily microwave at a distance, and you have, and Korotkov proved, thousands of miles telepathy every time. I mean, military grade telepathy proven with the Cozy Rev mirror. But the point I'm making was that they knew that for that to work, they had to set those up at magnetic line crosses. Exactly the way any intelligent geobiologist knows you have to start a labyrinth, or in fact, the best place to put a Theraphi. So if we begin to study the physics, and I do mean the physics of geobiology, and I recommend our background here, goldenmean.info/geobiology, that the sighting of significant Earth energy cross lines, which supports the propagation, piggybacks the propagation of the longitudinal EMF component. This increases the ability of the Theraphi unit not just to work and radiate the longitudinal, and we know it conditions its environment, but also then would increase the ability to do remote healing for someone at a distance. That's why there's a kind of telepathy between sacred sites. Remember, we have 3 different electrical engineering ways to measure sacred sites and bioactive fields. At the top, goldenmean.info/architecture, which is basically a weak capacitive field spectrum analysis. So when the capacitive field is harmonic inclusive, which is say fractal or conjugate, that indicates a resonant cross-point node, you know, successful non-destructive interferometry, and that is the definition of sacred space. Korotkov followed the codies, got to the place where they could make phone calls to ancestors. And then he set up the GDV gear, which later he measured with our biophoton technology, our Purify, Icosify gold cups, which I have right here, by the way. And we showed that you could induce that same resonance that with the capacitive purify effect that Karakov used to capacitively measure sacred space. And that's all at the architecture link. So now that we know so much about what sacred space is, which is simply harmonic inclusive charge distribution efficiency, a fractal field, we now know where the best place to put a Theraphi and a healing person, which is where charge distribution is enabled. It's why, you know, a very nicely energized, good-feeling, geobiologic feng shui room is so good for Theraphi, because when the Theraphi conditions its environment, the whole environment gradually gets conditioned. What that means is the environment becomes entrained and resonant too. Now, if that environment contains lots of metal and synthetics and electrosmog and dead air, not only will the Theraphi be less successful at conditioning its environment, but the Theraphi will be less successful at healing people. So the hospital medical documented research, which shows that negative ion wind therapy is so helpful for all hospital healing. Negative ion wind, you can heal spinal meningitis with a strong enough negative ion wind. It's proven. Well, the negative ion wind therapy depends on a natural material environment. If you have big metal structures and electrosmog and synthetics all over a room, negative ions die. This is instructive to exactly what the Theraphi requires as well. A negative ion is a little fractal. The Theraphi field is a big fractal, and they're both fragile. They're fragile in the sense that they require a charge distribution permissive environment. And that means natural materials in the environment. Fresh air, biological materials, stone, wood. It means reduce metal in that environment, reduce synthetic material environment, reduce any large surface that is conductive and would thus ground a negative ion in the same way it'll ground the Theraphi plasma field. Yes, negative ion wind. It was Joyce, our friend in Scotland, who was doing a cell care therapy with strong negative ion wind therapy. But we think the Theraphi takes that to the next step, actually. Mark is asking, is the Theraphi creating the same effects as a properly made pyramid? Well, you know, I, with Paul's help, invented Theraphi after I spent years researching how to build pyramid bioactive fields, purify.com. And we showed that we were able to create a growth environment, dramatically affect seed growth, etc. And the purify.com, which with the accompaniment Icosify, were immensely successful. These things were effective. The problem is they were ridiculously expensive. We were using large-scale gold, and there's a whole sad story of my partner Andrew, who got gold poisoning from doing so much work with the gold, and was hit by lightning on the sacred mountain here related to the gold poisoning in his aura. Very long, complicated story. Point being that the capacitive implosion that we could make from the properly conducted pyramid was definitely implosive bioactive and capacitively centripetal, exactly like Lakhovsky. But then when I saw the opportunity to make that more broad spectral by taking the same harmonics, and we scaled the Purify Ecosify to the same equation on the cover of my book that we built Theraphi with, but the opportunity to take that more broad spectral by using plasma and noble gases, far more broad spectral, therefore implosive with much more leverage up and down the molecular atomic scale, that was the opportunity Theraphi made to take it to the next step. So yes, we're creating the same effective pyramid, but much more broad spectral and therefore much more potent. Another comment I would make is that those Russian pyramids, you know, our friend who was teaching how the Russians are building their new pyramids was with us up at the Paris conference with Nassim there recently. And sadly, that group was unaware that putting steel and aluminum in those pyramids was poisoning them. Bad news. But, you know, they didn't understand. Now, Sam in Prague, he really understood that. We had a great conversation about this. But it's instructive to know the reason that steel and aluminum, when you're building a pyramid, is going to poison the structure, is because the capacitance damps the charge distribution efficiency. The way electrical engineers talk about that is the dielectric constant. So the dielectric constant means the insulator between the plates of capacitor rings more perfectly like a bell. And so natural material have high dielectric constant, biologic material, because every molecule that's part of biology and wanted to join the club got fractal or got dead. So that when those seashells die, the molecules in the seashell, the highly alkaline, limestone, has a high dielectric constant because molecular symmetries remain fractal in the dead seashells, meaning that when you ring that capacitor, it rings like a bell very efficiently, which means when your aura in train embeds that capacitance of biological material in your building, the charge can distribute it efficiently. Whereas if you put steel and aluminum between the plates of capacitor, that capacitor don't ring at all, and your aura is killed. Actually, there's a technical term for killing your aura. And you can feel that for yourself. Just take a big piece of aluminum and hold it in your hand for a few seconds and decide, did my hand get numb? The reason your hand gets numb, it's not about temperature even. The temperature is, that just hold a piece of aluminum in your hand and notice that the blood circulation is reduced. It's simple. The aluminum inhibits the capacitive distribution of charge, and that's how you know aluminum is poisonous to every living thing. It's not that the alum is evil, it's just that the amperage they used to freeze the bauxite into aluminum was opposite to conjugate and fractal, and therefore the symmetry that resulted electrically in the aluminum atoms in the molecular array was opposite to fractal, and therefore it's literally, in the spiritual sense, misqualified energy. Aluminum plants are a mistake. They're bad karma. They cause massive pain to the earth. There's a huge number of stories, a giant aluminum manufacturing plant in Iceland and another one in Europe. Aluminum manufacturing is spiritually evil. It is bad karma. It radiates disasters around aluminum plants because these atoms and molecules do not want to be frozen out of fractality.